All right. And we're live today on Energy Superheroes. Today we have Alice Schmidt, and she is an author, speaker, and consultant. She's written a book called The Sustainability Puzzle. I think that's a really exciting title, very intriguing. And she's going to tell us about that today, as well as some of her work with some significant companies and governments and nonprofits at the intersection of people, planet, and profit. Alice, welcome to the podcast today.
Hi, Peter. Very happy to be on the show.
It's great to have you. So tell us, what is the sustainability puzzle?
Well, the sustainability puzzle goes back to this question that I keep facing, that I keep getting from companies. It's like, what is sustainability, right? And everybody has a slightly different understanding. Some people really focus on the environmental aspects, right? They talk about climate change. Others see more the social aspects in the foreground. And of course, businesses, want to know about business. And so the sustainability puzzle tries to bring all of that together. And what we're saying, I wrote the book together with a colleague, Claudia Winkler, and we're basically saying the solutions are there. We know what needs to be done to make the world a better place, to actually achieve sustainability. The problem is only that, well meant is not always well done. And lots of small solutions don't necessarily make a greater good, right? So we're saying you need to put on a systems lens. You need to zoom out. You need to look at this bigger picture first of sustainability before then zooming in and implementing individual solutions, right? And so we've defined 6 pieces of this puzzle, which are climate action, circularity, circular economy, technology, responsible consumption, sustainable business, and playing fair. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what I mean, right, by that. So I think it's very important in the climate space that a lot of people really understand now, right? Climate denial is something that we're not encountering much anymore at all. What we are seeing is sort of that people still feel that climate change is very far away, right? Both geographically, in terms of time. And that's something where we really need to get action going and accelerate action. And one reason we're not getting this action is that many people still think that it's about saving the planet, right? We kind of in this altruistic space where we do what's good for business, and then maybe if there's time and money left, we'll save the planet. That's not at all what this is about, right? Because the planet, the ecosystem rather, is actually providing all these services that we as businesses depend on, right? And sometimes they're called the ecosystem services. There are provision services, right? Provisioning services, providing food, materials, energy, and all of that, right? There's also regulating services, and regulating the climate, filtering water, all of that are some of the services that we're actually getting for free. And for the longest time, it served businesses, it served us humans well to use more and more of these services. But now we've put the ecosystem in such a state that it can't actually perform as well anymore, right? And so it's in our very own self-interest to really do this. And that this is part of the system thinking that I'm talking about, and part of the climate action piece here. And then, of course, the circular economy piece is, a really important one. Businesses often love it because, it's all about business. And it's very closely linked to climate because almost half of the emissions are actually embedded in products, right? We know that resources are finite, they're getting more expensive. And so there's a very clear business case for producing less, producing differently, reusing. And recycling is actually only sort of the last resort, right? It's really about keeping materials and products in the loop for as long as we can and designing them in a way that they can actually be a system of repair, of refurbishment, and all of that, right? So that was the second piece. And then there is the sustainable consumption piece, which is super important. Yeah, consumers, they vote with their wallets, and unfortunately, these days, actually, greenwashing is everywhere. The European Union actually has a new regulation coming up to fight that because almost half of products actually have some kind of misleading claim on them. And for consumers that want to make a difference, that's really hard. And often companies suggest to consumers in their marketing, in their communications, that buying more of something can actually be good for the environment, that there can be a net sort of zero benefit. That's not possible. There can't be a net benefit, right, by consuming more from an ecological perspective. And so this is really an action where I see some companies really far ahead, but some still investing in greenwashing rather than investing in sustainable transformation. And I think that's they're basically losing out on a really opportunity. They're losing time, right? And while the competitors are moving ahead. And then, well, there is technology. It's a very important puzzle piece. I'm dealing a lot with AI these days, trying to see how artificial intelligence can actually, bring us to a better, more sustainable world. There's a lot of dangers, but there's a lot of potential and opportunity there as well. And technology is great, yeah, but it won't save us on its own, right? So it's one piece of the puzzle. And then, yeah, sustainable business is there. The business case, I've spoken a bit about already, and I think businesses need to prepare to start internalizing the cost of unsustainability much more than they have been, right? And then, well, finally, in the end, this is all about people, right? So it's nice to distinguish between people, planet, and profit stuff, right? Ecological, social, and economic issues. But in the end, it's all connected. And in the end, it's always about people. And it's not just about people like you and me, who are quite comfortably placed in rich countries, but actually people everywhere on the globe, because only social justice will actually help us bring us forward, right? And guarantee peace and stability. So these 6 puzzle pieces we're exploring in the book. And then we're saying, well, in addition to this, sort of as like the pepper and salt, if you will, right? You need a healthy dose of optimism. You can do it, but you need to measure, right? Otherwise you can't really manage your success. You don't know whether you're actually making, progress. And you need to find solutions that don't pitch, say, climate versus business, but actually that creates win-wins, right? Across people, planet, and profits. And only by that will achieve sort of health, wealth, and well-being for all. So that's it in a nutshell.
No, it's very comprehensive. It reminds me of some of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I think are great. Why don't we start at the end there with people? Because you're calling in today, I believe, from Austria. Is that right?
I do. Yes, I did.
So it's a beautiful country. Of course, I've been to Salzburg, Vienna. I love Austria. It's one of the most beautiful countries. So I have to ask, right from the center of the EU, how do Western democracies, where people, of course, have a say in policy, how are they able to show people that what's in it for them in terms of these sort of challenges? Of course, we want less pollution, more conservation, sort of the traditional goals. But when it comes to things like, let's say, a carbon tax, which may make products more expensive, how do you get people on board with that and get them to support it?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for, saying nice things about Austria.
It's
It's
easy to say nice things about Austria. I only say what I believe.
wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. And I mean, the carbon tax, which is one of perhaps the biggest lever, right? The most important lever, carbon price more broadly, right? When it comes to creating a level playing field also, right? In terms of climate action. The question is always, how high is that carbon price? Yeah. And even in the European Union, which is ahead to some extent, right? When it comes to climate action, it's not like we have, enormous carbon prices everywhere. In Austria, we started with a very low one, actually, of 30, 35 euros, which is, really not very far from the 200 or more that we would need. And I think people are slowly beginning to understand that by taking climate action, including by paying a fair price of energy for energy, right, they will be better off. But of course, this always depends on the energy mix. In Austria, we're quite fortunate, right? We rely a lot on water, hydropower, so that is an asset, right? And even in the European Union, right, we see a wide variety of sort of scenarios there. The European Union has been quite progressive, particularly in recent years. A lot of legislation has come out. I see that the CSRD, as it's called, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is particularly on companies' minds these days. They know that their reporting will really have to be up to scratch in terms on, and it will actually be at the same level as financial reporting. And that's a big game changer, I think, right? And the CEO will actually have to be liable for the data they provide. And at the moment, a lot of companies don't really have this data, this ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance data readily available. So a lot is happening there. And I think perhaps you're also alluding to the point that some citizens feel that, the sort of climate, the culprits are elsewhere, right? I don't know if I'm hearing this correctly in your question, but I'm getting this, right? Why would we in Europe, do all this make all these efforts when, there's big Chinas and Indias out there. Yeah? For a little country in Austria, I mean, that's in a way, it's a legitimate fear, right? I think there is still a lot we need to do. And as a matter of fact, we've been the ones, we as in rich countries, the US, Europe, and so on, right, have been the ones emitting the most so far. Yeah. So if the question is always, do you start now or do you start 100, 200 years ago, right? And so that changes the equation a bit. But perhaps let me, understand your question in more detail.
No, that's a good point, and I think you touched on something because when it comes down to the total accounting, CO2 is cumulative. So if you look at it from some numbers in the past, then you can level the playing field a little bit.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and it's also interesting because a lot of companies, in their quest and endeavor to go net zero, right, to become carbon neutral, I mean, they start now, and there's very few companies that actually take responsibility for historic emissions. Microsoft is one of them, right? And I'm not saying we can debate whether carbon offsetting is the right way to go. I mean, it's a piece of the puzzle. Of course, there are other bigger levers as well. But taking responsibility for historic emissions is quite an interesting approach. And I think one that should be supported. It doesn't change the fact that, of course, today we have huge economies such as China that perhaps per person are still emitting, much less than richer countries, like the Arab states or the US in particular. But in aggregate, of course, this still amounts to a lot. Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of China, we must remind ourselves that they're also the biggest investor in renewables, right? So it's not all bad. Things are happening there as well. They've also set reasonably ambitious climate goals. And of course, I mean, I'm not arguing for autocracy or anything like that, but it's easier, right? In a sort of slightly less democratic system to push through with certain actions, even policies, if you really want that.
Yep, no, that makes sense. And so where I was kind of going with the question was, I think what we're starting to see is energy is one of the largest cost inputs when it comes to making products. And as we do more aggressive, say, accounting for CO2 as it relates to energy, what we've seen is in the States, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, is some inflation. When you start to see inflation on basic consumer products, as you make the manufacturing more costly there, and I think people are starting to come to grips with the fact that there is a cost for implementing these types of policies, at least in the short run, until technology catches up and is able to, of course, if we have fusion energy or one of these, call it moonshot technologies, then it could change everything quickly. But where we sit today, the costs of basic products are going up, including we're seeing big inflation in the United States in food, which effectively behaves like a regressive tax on people. And so what you're starting to see now is, as you know, the rise of populism here in the States, I think maybe to a lesser degree in Europe. How do you get everybody on board with policies when I think you hit the nail on the head? A lot of people look at it as far off and they're just trying to think about paying their bills month to month.
Yeah, I mean, that's super important, right? Because the social in the end matters. And sometimes, I mean, there are opportunities to create actually win-wins across the ecological and social sphere. And sometimes they're at odds, right? We're seeing this with the SDGs and we're seeing this sort of, in real life as well. To come back to the carbon price, of course, the beauty about a carbon price, right? Which basically puts or increases the price, raises the price, right? For dirtier forms of energy more than for cleaner forms of energy, right? It's beautiful also because the money collected can then be used for redistribution, right? To the people that need it the most. And so it actually has this inbuilt social mechanism. Yeah. I mean, transformation takes time. And I totally see also the rising polarization that you mean. I think often this is, of course, we're getting into very complex sort of, I think, topics here, right? And politics and policy and all of that. And lobbyism, right? Lobbyism is something that I think also needs to be there. But I think we also need to be clear that we're still subsidizing, governments around the world are still subsidizing fossil fuels with actually, it used to be a few hundred billion per year. Latest data from the International Energy Agency says it's more than a trillion, right? as that's subsidies to oil, coal, and gas, right? The biggest culprits of in terms of climate change. And if that money was used for sort of making price hikes more palatable to, poorer people, I think that would be a good thing. Yeah. It's very difficult, right? Because we have entrenched systems, we have certain structures, we have certain incentives that are there. But else that's also something we just need to be open and honest about, right?
Yeah, there's no easy answers here. When we talked in the show, before the show, you talked about you bringing together early in your career the nonprofit world and the corporate world. What can the corporate world learn from the nonprofit world and vice versa? What can the nonprofit world learn from the corporate world?
Great question. Yes, indeed. I started off in business and then ventured into, working with the United Nations and NGOs and governments. And one of the things that NGOs have been far ahead on is measuring impact, measuring basically social impact, environmental impact, and not just sort of, financial outcomes. I used to work a lot in the health sector as well. And there it was just, it was standard to do, to monitor, to evaluate, to analyze. And with businesses, I find that, there's goodwill, right? They know they have to look beyond the financial bottom line, but they're also struggling. And sometimes I'm surprised that even large businesses don't have, what I think of quite basic data. So it's a matter, of course, of prioritizing that, of taking it seriously. So I think that's certainly something the for-profit world or companies can learn from the not-for-profit world. In terms of the other way around, so I think the not-for-profit sector, if you want to generalize, right, it's a big sort of world as well with lots of sort of this diversity. But I think it's a certain sort of can-do approach, right? Testing things, trying things out, even in the face of incomplete information. There's certainly something still about communications, even though I feel NGOs, for example, have become much, much better at communicating. Yeah, they kind of have to, right? It's the world we live in. But yeah, and in the end, you want them to work together, right? Because we're talking about the wicked problems, we're talking about complex problems, and they cannot be solved by any one actor or sector on its own, right? They need everyone to really work together. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the NGOs, UN reaching out much more to corporates, whereas in the past, right, they would have been perhaps scared. They would have seen companies as the enemy. Yeah. And on the other hand, I think we're also seeing that corporates understand that they can learn from others, right? So that's certainly a positive development, I'd say.
And no, for sure. Now, I want to hone in on the NGO concept. I think this is an area that in the US anyway, it's less understood than I think in Europe and globally. Can you talk about maybe some NGOs that you're working with or have worked with and give us maybe do a little bit of a case study on your consulting practice or the value that they bring in essentially as positive contributing to the world?
Yeah, sure. So, NGOs, at least the ones I've worked with, have been working on sustainable development long before that was something everybody talked about, right? So before the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal area, we had the Millennium Development Goals, right? And that was the first time the one actually came together. And even before that, we had all these goals around sustainable development, even if they were called something else, right? So I can speak a bit about my experience in the health sector. I've worked with a number of NGOs in that field, such as Save the Children or CARE, right? Doctors Without Borders. They're two of my favorite NGOs. And, they all have slightly different approaches. But I think one of the things they do really well is that they have their feet and their eyes where the people are, right? So in my case, I work with them in Africa and in Asia, and they go to the remotest villages and really understand what people need there. And, some a bit more paternalistic than others, but in essence, I think many of them really try to work at eye level, right, with the people they're trying to benefit. And so it's really this local knowledge, local insights that they bring to the table, and which they then can use on the one hand to provide services, right, where governments perhaps aren't able or willing to provide services, but also to advocate for better policies. And I think that's really strong. And I see this now in the environmental sector, right? So organizations like WWF, right, the World Wildlife Fund, right? They're at least here, I feel that they're at the forefront of getting action going, also working with companies, right? And I see a lot of big corporations approaching them and asking them how they can move towards achieving the Paris Agreement, right? Becoming sort of reducing their carbon emissions. I see them also setting up standards to avoid greenwashing, right? I think greenwashing is such an important topic as well. So they have a very important role to play. That's for sure, right? In the end, it's always about balances, checks and balances, as we know.
No, for sure. And what is an NGO that you've maybe worked with in the past, or that you mentioned the World Wildlife Fund? Is that one that you've worked with, or is there another that you could maybe talk to a little bit?
No, I mean, I worked with Save the Children. I worked with MSF, Doctors Without Borders. I worked with Water Aid. I worked with, quite a few others. And in the end, it was always a different experience, right? It was a different, for me, it was a different country. Sometimes I was in the head office in London. Other times I was in a country office or field office in West Africa, right? So the experience was different each time, also depending a bit on the topic. I mean, one of the things that I focused on was advocacy, actually, right? So trying to also to form coalitions, and these coalitions, for example, in West Africa, right? I worked in Sierra Leone, and at the time it was about improving access to healthcare for poorer people, marginalized populations, right? What was super interesting there was all these NGOs coming together, working largely in the space of health. Some were US, you sort of had a US origin, others came from different sort of geographies or were headquartered in different parts of the world. And even them coming together, deciding on sort of speaking with one voice, right, to the government, that was already quite an achievement. And yeah, I felt, I mean, in many cases, without them, things, would be not where they are today in a positive way, I mean. And there's always a problem because they also fill gaps, right? And where they provide services, where they run hospitals and clinics and all of that, the government might feel sort of less obliged to do so, right? But of course, you need to talk. And so that's why, of course, a lot of NGOs, including the ones I've worked for, look at system strengthening, right? They don't want to just replace the government. The idea is to work with the government, to support the government, to strengthen the government in providing these services, right?
And no,
Just-
that makes a
yeah,
lot of sense. It's critical services, and I can imagine the idea is to provide it for some amount of time and then transition that to the government, because you don't want
exactly.
the NGO to be there forever.
No, absolutely. Yeah, you might still want it to be there sort of as a watchdog to an extent, right? But yeah, you want to sort of work yourself out of the picture in a way.
Yeah, so that's a big difference from a corporation, right? Companies like to keep themselves in the picture. So
Exactly. Incentives, right? I mean, incentive systems are so important. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. So amazing that you spent that time in Africa. Maybe could you talk about how you feel about the African continent? I hear a lot of positive things. I also hear a lot of concerns. What's your view these days?
Yeah. I mean, a great question. I mean, first of all, the African continent, at least when I speak to people here, is still very much unknown, right? People think of Africa, they talk of the Africa as if it was one country, when in reality, there are, 50 odd countries, right? 50
So
plus,
massive.
right? Exactly, right? And they're totally different from each other, right? That's one thing. The second thing is Africa is much, much larger than most people think, because we're used to seeing, right, the Mercator projection of the world map, which basically, the challenge is always like, how to depict something that's three-dimensional in a two-dimensional space, right? So something's got to give. And we're used to seeing a map where Africa is actually much smaller than it really is. So just even the size, right, of Africa is something people need to understand better. I think The Economist had an article a long time ago, and it showed basically with pictures how I think all of Europe, all of the US, all of several other countries fit into Africa, right? And there's still some space. So I think that's also just important. Africa is big. Africa is important. Africa has already, 1.5 billion people or something. And by the end of the century, it's going to be 4 billion people. So it's going to be almost as, there's going to be almost as many people as there are going to be in Asia. Yet China's population is going to reduce very considerably, right? And Nigeria is going to be larger in terms of population than China. So I think, so this is something really to keep in mind, right? And then I think we also need to keep in mind that the population is very young, which comes with a lot of potential, right? In many countries, so if not most, like half of the population is under 18 or very young. And so there's a lot of potential, but you need to employ all these people. And we're seeing, some hubs, I mean, Kenya, is one of the sort of Nairobi, Kenya, right? I mean, we see this the sort of Silicon Valleys of Africa there, and we see how much is happening there and how entrepreneurial people are. And I think that's really fascinating. But we're also seeing, of course, that a lot of problems have not been solved, right? And some governments are better than others. There's a lot of change also. I mean, I've had sort of stints of time in countries where, the health minister kept changing. And, the moment you had a sort of policy reasonably developed, a new person came in and everything had to start from scratch. And of course, that's not ideal. So there's great potential, but also we can't sort of take it for granted that all these advantages is going to be just, created by itself. It needs to be very proactively created. I think that's important. Yeah, to
And
note.
now it's incredible. One of my favorite investment themes is digitization of Africa as well as South America and all emerging markets. Because I think what you're going to see is there's a lot of apps that have been developed in the United States and Europe that have sort of found their home, and those business models have been worked out. And we went through sort of 20 years of trying to figure out what apps and digitization business models work, but now porting those to other countries, and a lot of times the same business model will work, but it's not going to be the same company. So I
Yeah.
personally look for small companies that are sort of duplicating some of the Europe, US business models and taking them to places like Africa, because I think the opportunity is enormous for exactly what you say. I didn't know that Nigeria was going to surpass China. I knew it was growing fast. I knew that China was declining, but I hadn't heard that. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, totally. I mean, also in terms of green hydrogen, right? I mean, there are now several hubs developing in Africa. And I think there, of course, are examples of reverse innovation, right? Where things were developed in Africa for African markets and all of a sudden they're being picked up in Europe. So, yeah, it's great potential. And I think that's partly also why we need to keep this bigger picture in mind, right? That we talk about in the sustainability puzzle. It's a bigger picture from a geographic perspective, also from a sectoral perspective, from a cross industry perspective. And I think that's really important. Yeah, exactly.
But it sounds like you also have a background in health. And I think you've discussed maybe in the book some of the correlation between health, human health, and planetary health. Maybe talk a little bit about that, how that sort of dovetails.
Yeah. So, yeah, indeed, I have worked in the sort of global health, public health space for quite some time. Most recently, I spent 4 years advising the European Commission, International Partnership Directorate in that regard. And I think it was the World Health Organization that said that, I don't quote me, but it was something along the lines of reducing climate change or climate action is basically the best you can do for health, right? So it's the best health investment of the century. And I think this is important because what we often see in a not for profit space is that one topic is sort of competing against another, right? So it's not either you improve health of people or you sort of reduce climate change. It's actually both at the same time, right? I mean, climate change per se is perhaps something quite abstract, right? Or greenhouse gas emissions, something abstract. But when you see how the impacts of climate change actually have negative impacts on people, right? Be it through floodings, be it through heat, right? Droughts, all of that has a very direct health impact. Health infrastructure is being damaged, right? Even just air pollution, right? Air pollution is sort of related to climate change. The same, of course. I think it's 9 million people die each year from air pollution alone, right? So there have been studies that say that actually investing in climate action would pay for itself by reducing healthcare costs. Yeah. So these kind of sort of true cost analyses, I think, are super important. Yeah.
And no
Uh,
doubt.
yeah.
No doubt. So one area, this is not a popular thing to say, but one of the challenges that we have in the United States is systemic diseases like diabetes. And a lot of this comes from overconsumption. And I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to saying that you really can't have increased consumption and have that also be net zero. Any increased consumption results in some impact. Impossible to have zero impact. So we've got to get to a place where when it comes to consumption, we're just consuming less. And I think one of the best things that all of us could do, myself included, is consume a little bit less. And that's going to improve health outcomes. I think about my grandparents who lived to be well into their 90s. They really never had any sort of interventions. They consumed less and they They grew their own garden. It was local. They did all that. They had all that mentality. It was sort of Austrian German mentality. Actually, my grandfather was from Bavaria region. And it's amazing because when I visit friends in Austria, a lot of them still have that same sort of little mini garden and just the way of being. And I think we can learn a lot from our ancestors in terms of saving, consuming less. My grandmother used to she used to can goods and put them in the basement and keep them and all that sort of stuff. We lost that, I think, in the last 50 years. And we've got to get back to that. Consumption reduction is automatically good for health. And then physically doing things, whether it's growing your own local food or moving around, just the movement and reduced consumption is great for health. Being outside, all these simple things can
No,
have a huge
absolutely, right? There's this concept of the planetary health diet. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but basically the idea is that, by eating vegetables mostly, not exclusively, you benefit both your own health and the planet, right? By moving around much, much more, right? I mean, you create so many benefits. You create, like, as in, you walk or you cycle or, you take public transport to work, for example, rather than your car. And it benefits your own physical health, but it also benefits society, right? Because in the end, there's less pollution, your roads need to be built and maintained, and so on and so forth. There's money available to add more green space in urban environments, which again, increases biodiversity, improves air quality. There's this positive cycle that you can put into motion, right? This virtuous cycle where it becomes more appealing then for more people to move around on foot. And absolutely, I think in some senses, we need to go back to, you know, yeah, to how our grandparents lived. It's not a very popular thing to say, I find these days. But for a speech I did, I was researching how cities were depicted over time, right? Cities of the future were depicted over time. And if you look sort of in the, 20s, 30s, I don't know if you're familiar with Metropolis by Fritz Lang, right? Sort of one of these iconic films about, and basically the cities all concrete and there's some flying cars and there's lots of cars everywhere, right? There's not a single tree to be seen, right? And then when we look at Blade Runner, right, a few decades later, it was all about concrete. The thing that had changed was digitalization, right? So we saw lots of blinking lights and sounds, but still not a tree to be seen. And now when we look at designs of cities of the future, we see it's all about green space. We see public transport. We see people. We see spaces for people to hang out, right? Like in Barcelona, the super block systems, for example. So luckily things are changing. And I think we may just call it modern in the end, as you say. It's like your grandparents. Yeah.
I think Europe got it right. In German, they say the Fußgänger zone where you can walk. Europe has so many of the old traditional cities have so many walking areas. And I think
It-
our modern cities need to look at that and then add some green space. I live in an area here in Florida that they actually designed it with lots of walking area, it's just an
right.
amazing place to live. The quality of life's incredible. So many people are moving here from larger northern cities now. And it just took a little vision. And this was not polarizing at all to design a space this way. And everybody loves it. And so when people see that, it's like you don't have to beat them over the head with walk more. You just create a space for them and they
Exactly.
walk more.
Yeah, and they will realize that they actually like it, right? I think it's very much about changing mental models, right? And changing the way we think. And somehow in the West, we've come used to this thought that more is more. And, we want sort of convenience and we want all these disposable goods. Personally, I'm totally beyond this. I really don't feel it's convenient to buy something that's going to break, a couple of months later, right? Or a year later. I don't want to buy new shoes all the time or whatever it might be, right? And so I think this idea of circularity is also one that used to be normal and it's still normal, right? In many parts of the world, but people are just treating resources as resources and not as waste, right? We can always argue that there's no such thing as waste. It's a resource in the wrong place, right? And this is also something I think we have to get back to. And I feel that we're actually really increasing our convenience is improving through that, right? By keeping saying like continuing to get things of good quality that are repairable, but that can be maintained. So it's not better, right? To just buy something that breaks.
And no, it's incredible. And when you said that about the waste, I'm thinking of a company that we just met over in Israel. where they have a modular system that can convert small amounts of waste into hydrogen. And I think those types of technological advancements are going to really make a difference. I'm a big believer in distributed, technology are all over the place as opposed to massive central locations, and technologies that are innovative that can take some kind of waste product and turn it into something good. The complaint, of course, always about hydrogen is it's too expensive. If you
Mhm.
get it from a waste product, the cost is effectively zero because you would have just thrown that waste into the landfill. So these types of innovations coming out of the amazing centers, you see it in Silicon Valley, you see it coming out of Houston, a lot of innovation, Israel, Europe, other places, I think will allow us to leapfrog and be able to have an advantage that we're just not seeing today because we don't know what those technologies are going to be.
Exactly. And I think I mean, technological innovation is super important, but then there's also social innovation, right? That goes together with, engaging people, diversity, changing mental models and mindsets. Yeah. So I hear that you're also an optimist in essence.
I'm a big optimist. I'm a technological optimist. When people say, "How are we going to do this?" I say, "Well, when I first got on the internet, it maybe 10 or 15 minutes to load one web page. You'd push the button, you'd go make dinner, and you'd come back and you'd have your little newspaper on your web screen. And we thought that was amazing that it only took 15 minutes, that we didn't have to wait for the paper to be delivered. Right. And that's how it was. And they said, well, how are we going to fix this? Oh, we're going to run undersea cables with fiber. We're going to run them all over the world. It's going to be amazing. And nobody believed that was going to happen. They're like, how are you going to run a cable under the ocean? But we figure it out. We're an innovative people. We have so many people on this planet. And one of the things about having a bigger population is that we have more brilliant people and innovations come faster now. So just in the last 3 years, the innovations around hydrogen have been incredible. We're seeing tremendous innovations around nuclear technologies, small nuclear, again, distributed technologies. Carbon capture, we're seeing incredible innovations where they thought it was impossible to do carbon capture on certain types of waste streams. Now they're able to do it. And that's just in a very short amount of time. We saw, I think, post COVID, really an acceleration of focus on innovation around the sustainability, and we call it climate, energy, and infrastructure in our group, but it's amazing. So I'm a technology total optimist, I have to admit.
Well, we need optimism, right? I think there's no point in just, putting our head in the sand. I think that is happening, unfortunately, to a lot of people. And I can see why. And I do think progress is too slow, but I'm also sort of an optimistic realist, if you, yeah. And I think one thing to say though, because we've been talking about sustainability, right? In the end, sustainability is important, and I wrote a whole book about it. But in the end, it could be argued to be about maintaining the status quo. Actually, what we want is regeneration, right? We want more than that. We want nature to come back, perhaps not as it was, but not to just maintain the status quo. We want more diversity, more biodiversity. We want wild nature back, right? And I think that's something, and regeneration, of course, you can also interpret it in a social sense. And I think that's actually what we also need to get into people's minds. Yeah.
I agree. Sustainability is just step one. Then we have to go to regeneration. That's absolutely true because in many ways our ancestors had better lives. In many ways they had worse lives. So we have to come up with the ultimate solution that's going to be better for everybody going forward. I'm also unashamedly pro-human. I think that we as humans can do amazing things for the planet. We just have to put our mind to it and have the right incentive structures in
Yeah,
place.
exactly. And this is the really hard nut to crack, I think.
It's a
Uh,
tough one. We're making progress. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, they said there's got to be a third way. Like, obviously, the totalitarianism, communist type thing, it doesn't work. The free market is amazing. It unleashes tremendous innovations, but there has to be a third way that puts the incentive structure of the free market in place into some of these social goals. And I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard. So now if we can just make sure that we take into account the concerns of all stakeholders, that it isn't viewed as sort of corporatism, I think we can do it. I think we've made a lot of progress and things are going in the right direction.
yeah.
Yeah.
right?
So, well, Alice, this has been absolutely a pleasure having you on the show today. You've taught me a lot, that a lot of things I didn't know. So I thank you for that. Tell the audience how they can find you and what are the types of companies and organizations that you like to work with.
Yes, and likewise, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Peter. So I'm on LinkedIn a lot. Check me out, Alice Schmidt. I don't think there are that many. There's also a website, aliceschmidt.at. And then there is a website for the sustainabilitypuzzle.org. I'd love to hear from you. And in principle, I work with all sorts of stakeholders. I think particularly sort of mid-sized companies, but also NGOs, think tanks, right? Anybody who's interested in getting new ideas, new thinking, new research, perhaps also in terms of this intersection between people, planet, and profit. And I also do a lot of university courses in this space. I really like working particularly with professional and master students, and I do various formats on sustainability, entrepreneurship, and technology as well. So yeah, always happy to hear from people and exchange.
No, thank you so much, Alice. And I'll say, everybody, this has been Energy Superheroes, and you can find us on Spotify. Just look up Energy Superheroes. And we also have a YouTube channel at Energy.Media. Look us up. And this is Peter Perry. I'm on LinkedIn. Check me out there. I am an investment banker, and that's my day job. This podcast host job is just a fun thing that I love to do because we get to meet people like Alice who are making a difference for the planet, which I think is critically important. And, it's really been great, Alice, having you on today. Alice Schmidt is an author, speaker, consultant. She wrote a book called The Sustainability Puzzle. Make sure you look it up on Amazon and check her out on her LinkedIn page and website. Alice, thanks for being on.
Thank you, Peter. Great pleasure.